talk is There and Back Again, which is the subtitle of the book The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is me as Frodo, and that's Jeremy as Sam. I don't know why we did this, but we did this one year for Halloween during a lab meeting. I currently work at a startup around the corner called Stitch Fix, where I use machine learning to sell ladies' clothes. I'm not going to talk about that today. But if you're curious, I'd be happy to talk about that at the bar after this talk. So what do I really want to talk about? Well, I wanted to give you guys a bit of the narrative of my transition from working on really interesting neuroscience problems to coming out here to Silicon Valley to build out data pipelines and machine learning architectures, and really thinking about how we can combine these two things. Like, this is a very interesting group of people at Code Neuro, and the question I want to ask is, like, what can we do better together, right? So first, let me tell you about sort of how I was thinking about neuroscience when I was a graduate student. Whoops, that's cheating. So the neuroscience problem is really fascinating. So if we think about what we do, we interact with our environment. Like, we walk around, we look at things, we smell things, and we essentially sense. And then over on this side, based on our sensations, we sort of perceive the environment. And based on that, we make actions and we make decisions. And the crazy thing is that there's this piece of meat in the middle here that's sort of underlying all of these transformations from the environment to our perceptions and our actions. And it's a big mystery as to how this thing works, right? So it's just sort of a fascinating puzzle, right? And so when I was a neuroscientist, I was a theorist, and I wanted to sort of write down theories for how this might work. And one theory that is not original, but was maybe the brain is optimized for processing this information and also optimized for perception. And this is actually a slide from my thesis defense where we can test these theories with data. And I'm not going to bore you with the details of this, but to suffice to say, we looked at a bunch of sort of sounds and images and captured the statistics of these sensory inputs. And based on that, based on the theory that we developed, we predicted how the brain might encode these signals and their distributions, right? And so we looked at data from 5 different brain regions across many animals. And you know, if the lines go through the data, that means we're doing a good job, and it looks good so far. And we also made a bold leap to trying to explain perception as a process of, you know, Bayesian inference. And we looked at like perceptual studies and audition and vision, and again, the lines go through the data, so hey, it seems awesome, right? And around this time, this was around 2012, I felt deeply unsatisfied by this kind of work. Why is that? So first of all, it was very hard to get scientists to share this data for reasons I still don't quite understand. And second, probably even more troubling, was I was testing these ideas on the order of hundreds of observations, right? So I was only really looking at, you know, hundreds of neurons collected across organisms, and, like, you know, the brain has way more neurons than that. What can we really say if we're only capturing this little data? Similarly, in the psychology experiments, you know, it was tens of humans running studies in the lab. And for our data sets of images and sounds, you know, it was probably hundreds of sounds and hundreds of images that we were processing, right? So this was sort of very deeply troubling. Like, we're studying this intense system, and we're kind of impoverished with data. And keep in mind, this was you know, the old school days of 2012. So it was around this time I started looking into industry and trying to think about what kinds of problems they are trying to look at and solve. And, you know, for measuring environmental signals, you know, all these companies are just sitting on a treasure trove of data, right? So Google is trying to index and capture all the images on the web, right? So they're just, if you want to study vision, Google has all this image data. Siri, we're talking to this thing all the time, or at least I'm talking to this thing all the time. And if you want to study the neuroscience of speech, they're sitting on so much natural speech data. And even creepier, Fitbit, this thing knows when you sleep, it knows when you're awake, it knows how fast you're walking, how much you're walking. So if you want to study the neuroscience of movement, devices like Fitbit or, you know, wearable technology is going to give you a treasure trove of data. So my next question was, well, how on earth do these companies process this vast amount of data? So I did the natural thing, and I joined an ad tech startup. And so ads on the web, I'm talking about those banner ads that sort of follow you around, and the people that are making those banner ads are watching you, and they are processing that data to get better at selling you or sending you banner ads. And these things are generating millions of events per second, right? This is a non-trivial amount of data. So what I want to sort of tell you about is the architecture that me and several of my colleagues at the time built out to process this data. And it will become a useful architecture later on in the talk, so we'll sort of build up to it. So the first thing we did, we have ads, so you run an ad server, you point it to a simple REST API behind a load balancer, and under the hood, it's going to Kafka. Kafka is a distributed message bus, so this thing just sort of stores data for up to 7 days, right? And then from there, we wanted to process and clean up this data. So we looked at various stream processing systems. We've heard a lot today about Spark streaming, but there's other things out there. We also looked at Storm and implemented this as our stream processing engine. And what these stream processing engines do is take in streaming data and expose operations like map, flat map, filter, reduce, aggregate, right? All the basic things we as neuroscientists want to do to process our neural data, right? And then from there, we put this into a database that we wrote, and it's called Druid. And this is a scalable data store built for analytics. And the great thing about Druid is that it allows us to query our data very, very, very quickly, which will become important later on. Now, of course, there's some limitations of stream processing systems. So we forked the data off of Kafka, and we put it into a fault-tolerant data store. We used Amazon Web Services S3 because our architecture was all on EC2. But you can imagine piping this onto Hadoop file system. Now, once it's on there, we can do more of our traditional batch processing. Again, we heard a lot from the Spark guys, but a main tool also in industry is Hadoop. Open source by Yahoo for processing ads, essentially, from the beginning, right? And now that we have data into like a nice, clean, aggregated format, which we can get very quickly, this turns into a small data problem, right? So now I can load it in with Python using a query library, and we can start to do very interesting sort of machine learning on this aggregated, clean, nice data. And from there, we were making interactive visualizations powered by D3, right? And so now we can really understand what's happening interactively with our ad data, right? And there's sort of one amazing thing about this and one really frustrating thing about this. So first of all of this architecture is open sourced. You can download this for free and use it for free. And it's scalable. So this architecture just can handle tons of data, right? It's really amazing. And you could do stream processing, you could do batch processing, and really at the end of the day, you're going from ads to visualizations that help you understand those ads. Now, what's the troubling thing? It's the input right here. Do I care about this? I probably don't. I tried really hard to abstract it away, being like, hey, man, I just work on the pipes. I don't care about what's in them. But I do care about what's in the pipes, right? And I was also, similarly with my graduate school career, I was sort of deeply frustrated with my industry career. Because like, what am I doing with myself, right? And so I started to look back into neuroscience. So now we're back out of 2012, and we're back into now. And it's really exciting, right? So in terms of physiology, we're just sitting on so much data, right? Connectomics, how is the brain wired together, right? There's open data sets that describe this. Jeremy's work and others with the zebrafish. So we can record every single neuron from this organism while it interacts with the environment and moves around, right? And there's also other software, this thing called Brain Scanner, for example, which sort of aggregates all the data from various fMRI studies and exposes, what's happening in their brains along with genotypes and phenotypes, et cetera. Or at least I think that's what it does. I'm not really sure. But it would be cool if it did do that. And then in perception, similarly, this became a very sort of, I hate the word big data, but it became a big data thing. So some of my former colleagues released this open source software called SciTurk, where perceptual experiments are no longer limited to studying a few humans in the lab, but you can actually just put it up on Amazon Mechanical Turk and get thousands of people doing your task. It's really amazing. And the other thing I learned in industry, this is a tweet from Mark Andreessen, I believe of Netscape infamy, but if you're running a website and you're measuring anything and you're making changes based on this, you're doing an A/B test, and what you're really doing is a psychology experiment. And companies in industry are doing this all the time, right? So there was this infamous paper from Facebook about how they were tweaking your news feed. That was an A/B test, right? And they were doing a psychology experiment. So we can just generate a ton of perceptual data. So why am I telling you this? Because it's there and back again, right? So I went from neuroscience to building out these pipelines and back to CodeNeuro. Well, what can we do better together? And I think the future of the neuroscience looks something like this, where we have a lot of data about images and sounds and movements and the environment. We have a ton of neural data. And we have a ton of data about how we interact with our environments. And there's no reason why an architecture like this, I hope exactly this architecture, because I think it's rad, we can use this to gain insights into how this system really works together. By looking at sort of interactive visualizations of this. So we can go from data to theory to visualization of the theory and then back again. And this horse right here will process everything for us. And it's all free, right? And we can look at the code of it. It's really awesome. So that's the easy part. The hard part is, what problems are we trying to solve, right? So we know we have the data, we know we have the architecture. The really hard part is, like, what is the question we're trying to ask, right? And when I was skating today earlier before I got here, I was sort of thinking about trying to make this concrete, but I have a bunch of half-baked ideas. I'd be happy to talk about it at the bar, but let's just think about this. There's a lot of cool things. So basically, the thing I want to impart on you is to do this together. Neuroscientists, open source your code and your data and your theories and your ideas. When I was a graduate student, I wish I knew what GitHub was. I would have put all my stuff on there. I wish I knew what an IPython notebook was. I would have put that out with all of my papers so you could reproduce my figures, right? It would have helped me to get my ideas outside of just the ivory tower and more to people in industry that might care about this kind of stuff. And come hack with us tomorrow. There's all these cool tools, and there's people here that know them really well, and let's communicate and let's work on this stuff. Let's build stuff. It'll be fun. And engineers and data scientists, I don't know if there's many of you left, but for those of you who are, get excited about public neural data sets. So Jeremy's released his zebrafish data. You can load it up on Spark and use his Thunder analysis to look at it. This is a collaborative research. I don't remember, but I did a Google search for public neural data sets, and this is what came up. But it's a bunch of neural data sets hosted by Berkeley as part of some neuroinformatics thing. It looks pretty cool. And Open Connectome project, we can start playing with those data sets that we heard about in the last talk. And your tools help progress science, right? It's not just about serving ads and processing tweets and doing all these crazy things, right? Now, most of these tools were implemented for parsing log files off of servers, so it will take some work and thought to get them to be able to process the kinds of data that we need, like neural data and perceptual data and environmental data. Thank you.